But I want to talk about some figures now, some important people in this conflict. Let's start with Eisenhower. Do you think that Eisenhower was a good leader, the right man for the job, despite never having actually led men in combat?
Jake, I think he was a good leader. Now, although he had very, very little experience during World War One, the one thing that he did gain in between the wars is a great deal of experience in organizing the U.S. military, in particular, how it could be effectively supplied during the course of military operations. He became an expert on supply and resupply. Now, I know that may sound strange, that does this bring about an effective leader on the battlefield? It does, Jake. It does, because he's the one that once he comes to the fore uh, as a principal leader of our forces in Europe. He's the one that does bring about an effective supply system that enables us to carry off Operation Torch. That was a major, major, uh, a major effort by Eisenhower, not just in terms of countering the Axis forces, but determining just how well we could operate uh, effectively via a naval operation and resupply within a foreign country. And it proves to be a very, very effective operation. But he is very, very good at bringing that to the fore because of his training during the course of the interwar years. His training as a supply officer. One of his basic supply bases was Gettysburg. That's where he had his his office, and how and from which he commanded supplying of U.S. forces throughout the United States on this operation, on that operation. It was very, very key to him coming to further understand how important supply and resupply was during the course of any military operation. And he succeeds in bringing it about. He truly does.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also, after the war, like we know, he becomes president, and I think we see his keen sense of the importance of transportation when he creates the highway system. Eisenhower's the one who created the interstate highway system.
Jake, well noted. Yes, he saw how important the Audubon system was to the supply and resupply of the German military throughout occupied Europe. So yes, when he becomes president of the United States, in view of the fact that we were facing a communist threat after World War II, what was one of the major things he invested in? Yeah, resupply routes of the U.S. military throughout throughout the United States. And yes, it is the Eisenhower highway system that comes to the fore, the interstate system.
I think a lot of Eisenhower's magic also lies in the fact that he was very good at managing personalities. He was a good, not necessarily military commander, but he was a very good manager. And we had a lot of very colorful personalities in the Allied command structure. And I think he was very good at managing those. And that's another one of his maybe superpowers.
Jake, well said, because it is the case. It's one of the reasons why George C. Marshall had very, very, very much belief and faith in Eisenhower and the fact that he would succeed in bringing about military success wherever he was so assigned. Reason why he was given command of the operation known as Operation Overlord, D-Day invasion of Northeast, yeah, Northwest France. Think about it.
Yeah, one of those colorful personalities is a man who I find incredibly fascinating, and that is General George Patton, one of my favorite figures from the war. Do you think that General George Patton is a great man?
I do, but the way he carried himself out at times was basically It was upsetting. But one thing that Patton continually faced within his life is his inability to appropriately speak because he had a speech problem. And the only way that he could overcome this problem within himself was the way at times he acted, uh, not as much at home, but in the field. And that's the reason why you hear about him saying this or him giving this major speech, uh, provoking this, provoking that. He was, in essence, by doing it all, trying to overcome this defect within his life, and that is his stuttering that he felt he obviously needed to counter, overcome, and do so that he could impress others with the leadership that he wanted to exert.
That's interesting. So you think there's a level of insecurity there, and that's why he acted so brashly.
And it's really not known that this is had evolved within his lifestyle, but that is the case.
That's so interesting. I actually didn't know that. I'd never heard that before. But he's a fascinating character, and I'm young, so this is sort of my generation stuff. But if you've ever seen the movie Avengers: Age of Ultron, the villain in the movie Ultron, he's talking to Captain America, and he's talking to Captain America, and he says, imagine you, what. Let me get the exact quote here. He says, "God's righteous man, pretending you could live without a war." And I think that very much so applies to Patton because in civilian life, he was very problematic.
All right, good point. Good point. But again, take it, keep in mind what was causing these problems within his life, and that is his constant his constant fear that he was not being seen as he wanted to be seen, and he had to overcome this speech problem uh, that he had. So that's the reason why, in a sense, you saw him act the way he acted, via this film or that film, or via uh, how how he was quite actually moving on the battlefield. He did so in a very, very large way to overcome his lack of self belief in himself, and he succeeded, Jake.
I do think he was a great man, but he was a very successful commander. I think there's an interesting question here to be asked. Do you think people like Patton, uh, not necessarily bad men, but men who are willing to stretch the boundaries a little bit, step outside of the box, little heterodox individuals, do you think they're necessary in times of war?
To be honest with you, yes, yes, because there are times when you need individuals like that to step out in front of of all and encourage and men, women now to move forward. And not only that, but move forward with them, be with them, and in essence, demonstrate to them your willingness to succeed because you're trying to encourage at this time their willingness to succeed. It's the reason why he was one of the most successful commanders within World War II.
Do you think we're facing a problem with that in today's America with the level of political correctness? Do you think we'll ever see someone like Patton again? Because we have a very um, Victor Davis Hanson is someone I greatly admire. I listen to him a lot, and he characterizes us as a therapeutic society and kind of a little bit soft, a democratic society, and we're sort of unwilling to accept that type of behavior from our leaders. But God forbid if um, you know, some type of conflict did happen where we required that sort of behavior. Like we just talked about, sometimes people like Patton are necessary in times of war. Do you think that America is ill prepared for that?
Uh, Jake, one thing that I'm a retired military officer that served in the United States military for nearly 30 years. I served on active duty, served in the reserve, served in the National Guard. And what I constantly felt we needed was further development of leadership. And I concentrated when I was a commander. I was a battalion commander and later on a brigade commander. I continually emphasized field operations because that's where you learn how to effectively move on a battlefield. And I don't see us becoming at the moment that involved with these type of military operations, at least here within the United States. I read a lot of literature from the United States Army Reserve, from the regular Army, about what's being developed mechanically, what's being developed electronically, what's being developed in the air and at sea. But what I don't really see is any confidence being gained the actual military operations. And Jake, we need that now. We need that for one good reason, and that is if indeed we are going to go to war, say in Europe, in support of the Ukrainians, we need to definitely bring about forces that are being effectively trained in field operations. Only now am I starting to read it, that they're beginning to concentrate on deploying forces and, most importantly, deploying supplies. And Jake, one thing about deploying supplies now, supplies are to be supplied immediately, and up front, and not where we have to wait a period of time of having supplies put in a certain area and then therefore then transported to the front to supply the men and the women in battle. And this is one of the major problems that the Russians are facing in the Ukraine, because the one thing that they have continually faced is very effective uh, interruption of their supply chain, because their supply bases are located miles behind where their front lines are. And the only way that they can supply their front lines are via the very narrow roads located throughout the Ukrainian area. And as they try to move forward with armored vehicles and trucks and so forth, they are very effectively countered by the Ukrainians. And we're watching all that. And we know that if indeed we ever get involved over there, we're going to have to develop a supply system that's not miles behind our front forces, but basically within feet and yards. And that's what's now being analyzed within the U.S. military. How can we more effectively supply our frontline forces as opposed to what we had been doing in times past, and that is supplying them from miles back. And one other thing that we also need to come about is how to effectively gain air control over the battlefield. Because if indeed we don't gain that, like the Russians right now have over the Ukrainian battlefield, we cannot effectively operate as we had in times past. So air control is also another feature that we need to concentrate on.
Yeah, it's interesting you raise those concerns because it seems to me like Pete Hegseth is talking a lot about that sort of stuff. Are you a fan of Pete Hegseth? Are you hopeful about his leadership? Do you think he'll bring some of those changes to the leadership that we're talking about?
All right, Jake, all I can tell you is I'm not truly fully aware of that individual, his background, his goals. So I'm going to be watching. I'm going to be watching. So I truly don't have an opinion at this particular moment because I really do not know the person.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's an outside of the box pick, but I mean, I've listened to some of his stuff. I listened to his Senate hearing for his confirmation. I like some of the stuff he says. I think he's going to bring that strong leadership to the military, focusing on war fighting, not on frivolous, unnecessary policies.
Well, State, I hope so.
Moving on, we talked a little bit about this earlier. Let's flesh this out a little bit more, and that's the relationship between Stalin and FDR, which is interesting because the United States and the Soviet Union are obviously ideological adversaries to each other, but out of necessity, in times of war, they form an alliance. Um, they met twice at Tehran and Yalta. What did FDR think of Stalin?
He felt that Stalin is one who we did need to retain as an ally because of his military engaging the Germans and the German allies in Eastern Europe. He felt truly that we needed to keep the Russians in the war so that we could then effectively counter the Russians from the West. And regardless of how he may have felt about the individual and his belief in communism, at this particular time, what was so important was keeping Russia in the war as an ally so that they could be further used to counter the Germans. So it's a friendship that came about out of necessity, not the one like the other. No, it's a friendship that came about out of necessity.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think they respected each other despite their differences. Um, do you think FDR foresaw or envisioned post World War II relations with the Soviet Union? Do you think he saw the Cold War um, and what would happen after World War II? And do you think the Cold War would have gone differently had FDR survived?
Okay, that's a very, very good question. As far as what was being discussed politically is the development of the United Nations. And what he wanted to do, this is all prior to his death, obviously, in 1945. What he wanted to do was bring Russia into the political realm and also, via the United Nations, control Russia. Control Russia in terms of what Russia was seeking to do, then gain via the United Nations worldwide support to counter their effort. And I think he would have worked in a very diligent manner with various leaders of the world after World War II within the realm of the United Nations. Keep in mind, Russia now was involved because they were accepted as one of the major participant countries. To keep Russia well aware of the fact that whatever they might have tried to do in a military or a major political move, that they were going to counter. They were going to encounter the uh, the opposition of the United States and the nations, most of the nations, if not all, within the world. So I think he was moving forward to bring about a effective political and diplomatic move to counter the Russians after the war.
Yeah, I would have to agree. They respected each other, so I think they would have done a good job working together politically despite their differences.